Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with a former Major League executive and minor league owner known for his creative marketing and promotions, Mike Veeck. Mike is a third-generation baseball man, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, William Veeck Sr., and his father, William Veeck Jr., who you probably know as Bill Veeck. Their last name is spelled
Veeck.
But, as Bill's 1962 autobiography famously told us, it's pronounced Veeck, as in wreck. Oscar Wilde once wrote, "There's only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about." The Veecks are a baseball dynasty who have been talked about for over 100 years now, regardless of whether you think they're legendary or notorious in the telling of baseball's history. The family seemingly invented the idea of fans having fun at the ballpark, as opposed to just paying for the opportunity to watch a baseball game. They instituted special ballpark giveaways, theme nights, fireworks, and lots more, introducing the game to new fans and embracing anyone who is interested in coming out to support the team, regardless of race, religion, or gender. Our guest for this episode is the subject of the 2023 Netflix documentary, The Saint of Second Chances, which gives an in-depth look at not only Mike Veeck's professional life, but also his personal life. Mike grew up in the shadow of his hustler father, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1991, and is one of the most beloved owners in the history of North American sports. While working for his father during Bill's second stint as owner of the Chicago White Sox, Mike came up with probably the most famous and definitely the most infamous ballpark promotion in history, Disco Demolition Night. The stunt ended in a violent riot and almost blew up his father's career. When Bill Veeck sold the White Sox in the early 1980s, Mike's career sputtered. He was essentially blackballed from Major League Baseball, falling into debt and desperate to have another shot at a major league job. Mike became owner of an independent league team, the St. Paul Saints, which gave him an opportunity to show the world what he could do once again. Mike worked tirelessly to get back onto Major League Baseball's good side, eventually earning a job with the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. Since my time with Mike was limited, there was a lot about his life, both personally and professionally, that we didn't get into. A lot of the stories I would have asked him about were answered in The Saint of Second Chances. The documentary traces the history of Mike and his father, Bill, and reflects on the complicated legacies found not only in sports, but among parents and their children. I highly recommend watching it as a companion piece to this episode if you can. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Mike tells us what it was like to be the owner's kid while trying to make a name for himself in baseball as a young man. We find out how a decision Mike's grandfather made about marketing toward new demographics led to attendance records being shattered and the need to build a second deck at Wrigley Field. We learn how Mike's father helped break the color barrier in the American League by signing Larry Doby, and how he walked the walk as an advocate for civil rights off the field too. And we hear how Mike has done the impossible, living up to the Veeck family name by being a groundbreaking marketer, but more importantly, by standing up for the people whose voices haven't traditionally been heard in baseball. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth, so I've provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Mike and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Mike Veeck episode listed first on the main page under Latest Episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our previous episodes, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of the 3 seasons to date and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. But now, here's my interview with former Major League executive and minor league owner, Mike Veeck. Before we get to you and your story, I think it's important that we talk about a couple important people in your family. Your grandfather, William Lewis Veeck Sr., was a third-grade educated sports writer for the Chicago American. He wrote under the pseudonym Bill Bailey, and contrary to published reports, his articles were not always scathing diatribes against the Chicago Cubs or the White Sox, who he also covered. Instead, they were known as thoughtfully crafted analyses, with some providing vivid, striking details and portrayals of the two local baseball teams. How did he go from working for a newspaper to working for the Cubs?
One day, Mr. Wrigley read him, and I guess this must have been the moment that he stepped off the curb, because he called him up and he said, if you're so smart about how I ought to be running my baseball club, why don't you come over here and run it? And my grandfather, I don't think apocryphally, said, when I'm finished lunch, I'll be over. And and thus started a 14-year reign. And it's funny that you say that, because it is exactly true that he was not flowery, but he was amazingly accurate. People loved to read him because they knew they were there at the game.
Your grandfather passed long before you were born. What kind of stories did you hear about him growing up?
He was the nicest man in baseball, which was kind of an interesting approach for a Veeck. I had never heard of anyone being so beloved, but the word is when he died, he got silver from 16, back then, I guess, major league teams, or 15. His widow, Gracie, received condolences because he was eminently fair and he was very proper. So he wore a stiff collar and a tie every day to work and treated people with a tremendous amount of respect, distant but very respectful.
Your grandfather instituted weekly Ladies' Day games in which admission was free for women. They were an instant hit, with thousands of women streaming into the ballpark. The largest ever Wrigley Field baseball crowd, more than 51,000 in 1930, was a Ladies' Day product. And something like that seems like such a no-brainer, appealing to directly 50% of the population that is otherwise generally ignored, is again something that teams and leagues still struggle with 90 years later. Your grandfather was the first major league executive to promote a woman into an executive level when he appointed Margaret Midge Donahue to be the Cubs club secretary in 1926. She was the Cubs vice president by the time her career ended in 1958. Do you know anything about your grandfather's upbringing or about his mother that would have led him to value women so openly in a time when that wasn't super common?
No, I think that it came from their, Boonville, Indiana, and their Main Street America, and I mean that in every sense of the word, approach. They were, like his writing, not flowery, but just kind of matter of fact. And I think that he was first and foremost a pragmatist more than anything. And he looked out at the horizon and said, gosh, we have, as you pointed out, half of the population is of the female gender. And it just seemed natural to him. But I will tell you a story that my dad did tell me about him that I think gives you tremendous insight into his personality, and that was he took my father down to the counting room in Wrigley Field, and they had thrown all of the money out of the tills, and it was sitting in a large pile in the middle of the counting table, like the old days. And he said, Bill, what color is that money? And my dad said to his dad, it's green. And he said, and what color is the person who put that money in the till? And my dad, after a pregnant pause, said, of course I don't know. Don't ever forget that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was probably the basis for all of his feelings about people in general. I've always loved that story.
Yeah. William Lewis Veeck Sr. and his wife Grace Greenwood DeForest had 3 children, Maurice, who died at 8, Margaret Ann, and your father, William Lewis Veeck Jr., who went by Bill. Your dad was known as the Barnum of baseball, a nod to the showman and businessman P.T. Barnum, who founded Barnum and Bailey Circus, the greatest show on earth, and who himself was known as the Shakespeare of advertising. Bill Veeck ran 3 major league clubs, the Cleveland Indians, the St. Louis Browns, and the Chicago White Sox during 2 different stints. He owned the Sox from 1959 to 1961, and again from 1976 to 1980, buying the team a second time after discovering the franchise was near bankruptcy and likely headed to Seattle. And we could have very easily done an entire interview just about your grandfather and your father. We could do the same thing about your life and career, but let's power through some of the main points so we can get to you specifically. In 1940, your dad bought the AAA Milwaukee Brewers of the American Association. They won 3 pennants in 5 years, and your dad sold the franchise in 1945. But while he was a co-owner of the Brewers, he served for nearly 3 years in the Marines during World War II. A recoiling artillery piece crushed his right leg, leading to amputation of his leg above the knee and more than 35 operations over the course of his life. When he was in the hospital recovering, he read like crazy. Is that something that he always loved to do?
Yes. I mean, he was a voracious reader. And the thing that I always admired about was any topic. It didn't really matter. And the least interesting to him were biographies. So everything else was fair game. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that he didn't read them. He just, figured that how people interact is more interesting than how introverted they can be.
Interesting. Bill Veeck wanted to buy the Philadelphia Phillies in 1942, and there has been much debate about his intentions with that team if the sale had gone through. Some stories say that your dad fully intended to field a team full of Negro League players, but that when they learned of this plan, Ford C. Frick and Kennesaw Mountain Landis blocked the sale and the National League took over the operation of the club. In 1946, after having sold his interest in the Brewers, Bill Veeck became the owner of the Major League's Cleveland Indians. Veeck immediately made sure that all of the Indians' games were broadcast on radio and permanently moved the team to the larger Cleveland Municipal Stadium to play all of their games in 1947. Whatever your dad's intentions may or may not have been with the Phillies had that deal gone through, Veeck did break the color barrier in the American League when he signed Larry Doby. But not only did he sign a black ball player, he actually paid Effa Manley, the female owner of the Newark Eagles of the Negro Leagues, for his rights. And that's something that many of the white owners didn't think was necessary to do, including Branch Rickey, essentially stealing black players from the Negro Leagues owners who they had previously played for. So are we seeing a pattern here? Your grandfather and your father were both always trying to expose their team to as many people as possible. They were always hoping for and expecting big crowds. They were willing to work with women and willing to stand up for people who were otherwise underrepresented. That paid off because in 1948, after also signing the great Satchel Paige, the Cleveland Indians set an attendance record and went on to win the World Series. I know all of this happened before you were born, but did your dad ever tell you any stories about Larry Doby and Satchel Paige?
Oh, of course, and they hung around the house. I mean, I grew up with the Doby children. Larry Doby and I attended the Veeck documentary 2 weeks ago in New York together. Our families are just bound together, not just historically, but with a passion, love for the game, and because people need to stick together. So stories about them are rampant. First of all, about the 2.6 million people. Cleveland drew 3.4 million people in 1948. There were 600,000 to 800,000 women and children who were never counted on the turnstile. They just let them in for kids' clubs, ladies' days. And when people in Sabre go, well, I don't really know that there's a historical way to back this up, like the Phillies purchase. Mm-hmm. He just didn't want to pay the quarter amusement tax or whatever it was. So he just let them in. And so the point is Cleveland drew 3 million people 40 years before another major league team. So we allow no Cleveland jokes. And that must have been really tough for my dad because being a Chicago guy, suddenly they had quite a rivalry back then. Dad worked tirelessly for Satchel Paige to get work, not just for pensions reasons, but because he understood long before it was time. I mean, who cares how old he was? He was 6-1, I think, that year with an ERA comfortably under 3. And he helped them win a pennant.
Right.
And they were interesting people. Satchel, obviously very outgoing, spent years barnstorming, understood how to navigate. Larry Doby never really forgave him for being a sellout as far as he was concerned. Larry very reserved, very quiet, great dignity. It didn't mean that Satchel didn't have his own brand of dignity. It was just he wasn't going to spend a lot of time worrying about whether people liked him or not. Mm-hmm. He was the greatest storyteller I ever saw. As a child, he had an imaginary friend, Tom Thumb, that he kept in his pocket. And you can imagine if you were a 10-year-old kid, you were just like in awe. And Doby and my dad shared a great love for jazz. Unfortunately, not the same jazz. You know, Dad loved Satchmo and Dixieland, and Larry was a serious aficionado of Miles Davis and and of that ilk. Mm-hmm. Maybe not Wes Montgomery, but close. And so, but they had a great love of music. They went to what we would call shows now, but attended juke joints and jazz clubs where there were some greats playing, not just in Chicago, but around whenever Larry was alone on the road, and by alone I mean without Helen, who was obviously the greatest help in his life. Jack Robinson had handlers. He was college educated, and he had people around him. And whatever one thinks or history judges, Mr. Rickey, doesn't really matter. He took care of Jack Robinson and made sure that he understood in no uncertain terms that he had people around him. Now you fast forward, and you got Larry Doby, who's going to the Rust Towns. He's playing the Rust Belt.
Right.
And that's a tough act.
Well, a lot of people think that Doby had a harder time breaking the American League color barrier because he didn't have time to adjust. Robinson played in the minor leagues the year before. Larry Doby went from playing in the Negro Leagues to a week later breaking the color barrier in the American League. He had no time to adjust to those crowds, that style of ball. What do you think about that? Did he ever talk about that?
Oh, all the time. He could remember until 24, 25 minutes before his death who had manhandled him, who had been receptive, who was good. He loved Joe Gordon because Gordon made him feel welcome. Played catch with him when nobody was. Things that people can't imagine today were done to him, said to him. And, the whole thing was you had to keep him on the field. I mean, he couldn't have rabbit ears and go into the stands after somebody because it just wasn't the same as a white guy going after somebody. Right. So the slings and arrows that he had to endure were rampant. And it gave him a great understanding for black ball players. It did not translate to understanding young players throwing to the wrong base, things like that, which is why after he was the second black manager, once again behind a Robinson, which is really ironic, his managerial career never really took off because of the fact that he had developed so quickly. It was inconceivable to him that people on the club would throw to the wrong base, wouldn't pay attention back up a play. And he didn't really favor the African Americans on his team. But if you were a rookie and made a mistake, he didn't tolerate that with the same that a LaRussa could or the like. So
yeah. Bill Veeck is very famous for his wild promotions. Some would even go so far as to call them publicity stunts. But his goal was always to make the games enjoyable for the fans. In 1949, Bill's first wife, Eleanor, filed for divorce, and most of Bill's money was tied up in the Indians, so he was forced to sell the team so he could pay the settlement. A year later, he married her mom, Mary Frances Ackerman, and in 1951 bought an 80% stake of the St. Louis Browns. He staged Grandstand Manager's Day, where he gave out signs that said yes on one side and no on the other side, and let the fans vote on what the Browns should do next on the field. But his most memorable stunt took place in August of 1951 during a game between the Browns and the Tigers. In the first inning, Veeck sent in a pinch hitter, 3'7" Eddie Goodell. His strike zone was said to measure 1.5 inches, making it nearly impossible to throw him a strike. Veeck told Goodell that a man with a high-powered rifle was sitting in the stands and would shoot him if he swung at a pitch. Goodell walked on 4 pitches and was immediately pulled for a pinch runner. Did Major League Baseball get in touch with your dad after that?
Oh, that put him on the list. That was a long list of one. It's amazing to this day. First of all, there's only one picture. There is one picture. There's no video of it. And my dad used to joke if the people who said they had been there that day actually had, that he would still be in business today, long after his death. I mean, it was that kind of a joyous occasion. You couldn't have picked a better guy to have on the mound than Bob Kane, because Bob Kane got it. And, he wasn't above a little theatrical. I mean, Bob Kane's an important person in the history of baseball because of that appearance. And Swift got down on his belly, and Hurley caused a 7-minute delay because he had to see his contract, which, of course, had been sent through. But they smuggled him into town a week before, and they worked with him in the hotel incessantly because he was a ham. And the one thing that would make the gag not funny is if he swung.
Right.
He didn't, thank goodness.
Well, you mentioned Bob Kane. He was actually the only person associated with that event that showed up at Eddie Goodell's funeral.
Yeah, he sent Christmas cards. Bob Kane was a wonderful. Judy Bob, his daughter, and I are friendly and stay in touch. But Kane, we had him the first year in St. Paul because there's such wonderful ball fans there and get it. And he was so generous of spirit. And, there's still people who grouse about the promotion. It was just a fun thing. And, years later, I copied it by having Dave Stevens, a guy with no legs, appear. But the motivation isn't to get a picture. The motivation is to show what people can do. I mean, you talk about 35 operations that my dad had. That was the thing, was that there are people who do all these amazing things. They're just... all they need is a chance, a platform.
Right.
And so that's what my father passed down to me, that obviously he learned from his dad.
After the 1952 season, your dad suggested that the American League clubs share the radio and television revenue with visiting clubs. He was outvoted, but again, something absolutely visionary. Veeck took advantage of some friction within the Comiskey family in 1959 and became head of a group that purchased a controlling interest in the Chicago White Sox. They went on to set an attendance record of 1.4 million fans at their home games that year and won the American League pennant before losing to the Los Angeles Dodgers in the World Series. You remember watching that World Series. Do you have a memory or two that you always think of from that series?
Yeah, I hate the Sherry brothers. That's terrible to say. Norm and Larry, they came from nowhere to have a magnificent series. We lost the series 4-2 to the Dodgers. I think still the largest crowd. Single game crowd in playoff history because they played in the old, I don't even know what you call it.
The Coliseum?
Yeah, it was, so it was 100,000 people to see a game. Things that I remember, first game we sat on the steps. I thought to myself, really? I mean, he owns the White Sox. Why are we on the steps? And my mother looked at me and said, he can sell tickets, honey. And I was like, oh, yeah, I get that. So to this day, Veecks have no given seats in any ballpark. Ted Kluszewski hit 2 home runs. I mean, I thought in the one shellacking before we got murdered, Kluszewski hit a ball off the facade in Comiskey Park that came halfway back to second. That's how hard he hit that bad boy. And, what kid doesn't love a guy who tears the sleeves off his uniform and operates with... gargantuan proportion.
Yes.
And he was the baby in his family, for God's sake. Dad had to take out 2 seats in what were then boxes of 6 to accommodate his family.
Wow.
Those were wonderful days. But it didn't matter. I mean, that club, that 59 club, Aparicio would single, steal second in a huge battle over the years with Maury Wills, but he would steal second, and Fox, who struck out, 12 times or something. It was unbelievable that year. Fox would drive him in, and they wouldn't score again for 3 innings. I mean, early Gus win on that club, and it was an interesting team.
You were born on March 5th, 1951 in Chicago. When your dad first got ownership of the Sox, you were around 8 years old. You grew up at Sportsman's Park in St. Louis and Comiskey Park in Chicago, and just around baseball in general. Was there a certain point in your childhood where you recognized that, this wasn't a normal upbringing, that you were having experiences that your friends weren't having?
First of all, one of the things that's dictated my behavior over the years is my children were both raised in ballparks. And they were present from morning until after the ball game and we went home. And the point was, they were raised in ballparks. I was not. And it was a treat. On Saturdays, I could go work in the front office. Going back to when I was very little, but only on that day. And Mother would take us aside and say, Johnny's father is a plumber. Your father is like a bricklayer. He's like Johnny's father, except that they write newspaper articles about what he does. Never mention it. If someone says they read something about your father, you can be proud and you can respond. But you never mention it, you never bring it up. And she was a press agent but the first female publicist for the ice show. She understood how it worked, unlike Dad's first wife, Eleanor, who was an accomplished equestrian but hated the press.
Mm-hmm. On May 26, 1959, your dad staged an invasion at Comiskey Park. 4 little people dressed as Martians landed on the field via helicopter and captured White Sox stars Nellie Fox and Louis Aparicio. Terms were discussed for releasing the 2 Sox players when the Martian leader said, "Don't bother taking me to your leader," talking about your dad. "I've already met him." That Martian was Eddie Gaudreau. Eddie was paid only $100 for his at-bat with the Browns, but he made over $15,000 for appearances after that. And while his life ended sadly and prematurely, it is nice to know that he and your dad remained in contact. Do you remember meeting Eddie?
No, I don't. And I would think that probably means that I didn't. But the stories about him were legendary. Back then, you could say that everyone called it the midget bar, and there were just countless stories about when he drank, he got on his muscle a little bit, and that was not good for his health.
Right.
But obviously, they were inextricably bound, we'll say, forever because of that one photograph.
Yeah. On April 28th, 1960, your dad unveiled the exploding scoreboard at Comiskey Park. He said he got the idea for it after watching Jimmy Cagney in The Time of Your Life. The 130-foot wide scoreboard featured lights, sirens, a soxogram message board, and multicolored pinwheels, and cost $300,000. The Chicago Tribune's Jerome Holtzman called it a screeching banshee. A firing platform back of the scoreboard will go into action when a White Sox player hits a home run. There will be noises of varying tones and intensities. The 8 small ladders atop the scoreboard will flash into electrical patterns. Strobe lights are atop the 2 higher ladders, and then bombs and fireworks also will be exploded from the firing platform. Your mom later told the Chicago Tribune that she had thought her husband's scoreboard, quote, wasn't very genteel. I mean, if you do something well, shouldn't you just be modest about it? Which, let's face it, isn't quite the Veeck way. But like you said, your mom was the original publicist for the Ice Capades, and once said about your dad, quote, keeping up with that man is tougher than keeping track of a couple hundred people on tour with the Ice Capades. She did TV and radio shows with him in St. Louis and Chicago, often doing the research and booking their guests. She also used her marketing and public relations experience to help your dad's ball clubs. She once composed a letter that the St. Louis Browns mailed to parents of newborn boys, congratulating them on the birth of a potential rookie and inviting them to a game. And she even helped design the White Sox shorts uniforms that they briefly wore in 1976. And while at first they may have had differing views on the scoreboard, she eventually came around to love it. It seems like your mom and dad were just meant for each other.
Yeah, it was a partnership in every sense of the word. They had 6 children together, and not one of whom was born in the same state. So travel was included in membership in the family. You know, when they were first married, I guess my dad was smooth because he talked her into living in Sportsman's Park, which he didn't do when he went back to the White Sox the second time. He wasn't able to convince her that that was a good idea. But that scoreboard, which in my estimation was the real hallmark. And to address something, I let it go when you said it because it is used often. There isn't a Veeck Live that likes the reference to P.T. Barnum because Barnum believed there was a sucker born every minute. And my father never believed that.
Yeah.
He was a man of the people. If it made him laugh and it made people that he respected laugh, he would go with it. He ran his ball club as democratically as is possible because he made decisions that would benefit the fans. And the joy, every man, when you hit a home run, you know, not very many people can do that.
Right.
I mean, that's a really difficult thing to do. And it should be a cause for a celebration. So in the time of your life, when the pinball machine explodes and everyone feels this oneness with this celebration, this mini celebration of life, that's what made the scoreboard so successful. And more importantly, the detractors, they're still around. They're still shooting fireworks. So obviously, there was something that was really founded in fact in the need for a mutual celebration. Mm-hmm. Pearsall threw baseballs at it. Stengel came out of the dugout with sparklers. I mean, it engendered all kinds of silly behavior that gave people things to write about, things to laugh about. And as a child, to be 9 years old and to see him build a 130-foot toy in the center field bleachers, and I know it wasn't his money, I looked at him and said, Geppetto's got nothing on this guy.
It's so clear that you truly and genuinely love baseball. Was there a moment when you remember consciously thinking to yourself for the first time, man, I really love this game?
Yeah, I got in the elevator. Because back in those days, you could live in hotels. You know, if you signed a long-term lease, they were just a little fancier apartment buildings, but they'd knock down the wall, you know, and the drywall, and suddenly you had an apartment if you signed a year's lease. So it was nothing to see Aparicio and Fox in the elevator. And I didn't ever know what to say. Every night I would go to sleep with this little white Zenith radio under my pillow, listening to the ball game, even after we moved, after he sold the White Sox and we moved to Maryland. And it was that time that I always describe it as baseball cards coming alive, That's where my life was different. Most kids don't grow up and see early winter Hank Greenberg, walking through your front door.
Right.
And that's where the life was really interesting. The people that are interested in baseball, that play baseball, that report on baseball, are usually more Renaissance people. The great literature is written about baseball. It's not written about football. It's not written... Doesn't mean they're not lovely games,
right.
But it's just a more cerebral. It's a difficult game to play. It's a difficult game to understand, to master. And it's a wonderful game to just sit and visit. And that's the allure, I think, over the years. I mean, obviously, I wasn't good enough to play. I learned that by the time I was in Pony League, for God's sake. I had a curveball that broke 150 feet, but it always went in the same spot. I mean, you could close your eyes and swing through it and knock it out of the ball yard. So I just wanted to learn a trade so I could be around it.
Mm-hmm. Your dad regained control of the White Sox after Mayor Daley basically called him and begged him to come back and save the team from moving to Seattle. You're about 25 years old and opening letters from fans who were sending in money to do whatever they could to save their team and keep them in Chicago. What did you guys do with that money that was sent in, and what kind of impression did that leave you with for the support of the fans?
We gave it to the Nelson Fox Cancer Fund, and that's where the money went. And it showed what I said earlier, that people loved Bill Veeck's clubs. And the reason that they loved him was because, yes, he was a funny guy, but he was one of them. He knew that they knew that he would make the best decision for their club. And so they rallied round, and, baseball in its usual fashion couldn't get out of its own way. Oh, it wasn't really going to Seattle. And so he had a lot of fun with it. And that's where the money went, to the Nelson Fund Cancer Research. And I just thought to myself, man, they trust this guy. See how many clubs they'll mail money to now.
Yeah. On the day of the home opener of 1976, you guys did the bicentennial stunt, where your dad, manager Paul Richards, and Rudy Schaefer all donned Revolutionary War garb as the drummer, fife player, and flag carrier. So literally right from the very start of the second time around, you're having these extravagant events and putting on a show for the fans. Tell me a little bit about that day.
That day was remarkable because he kept it under wraps. And Paul Richards was not the easiest fella to convince that this would be a really lovely gag. And I think that they convinced him because they were willing to do the second and third verses of the anthem. But that fife and drum and walking out with the bandage was just a brilliant, on so many levels. I mean, people don't give promotions. I mean, gimmicks and garbage like that they're not the correct nomenclature for them. There was some intellect. It was the country's birthday. Mm-hmm. It was 3 old war horses coming back for what could be and turned out to be the last hurrah. So it was an inside joke. The fans loved it. The fife and drum worked perfectly with his peg leg. And, it was the south side of Chicago. It was a working class ballpark in a working class neighborhood. And this all made sense. And he really understood the pulse of his audience.
There was a rumor that someone had been murdered in Comiskey Park and dumped down the elevator shaft. In 1976, you were lowered down into that elevator shaft and cleaned it out. What'd you find?
Oh, I found Black Sox contracts. I found a treasure trove of things that we ultimately donated to the hall. But I started in December, really, or January of 76. And when you're known as kid, people just really don't have any use for you. So during the day, I worked in the office learning about sales and learning about hustling tickets and selling sponsorships and the like. But in the evenings, I cleaned out the 57 storerooms that were Comiskey Park. And I did that for 2 reasons. One, to find stuff that we could not peddle, but use as some leverage in case we ever needed it with the then league offices, but also to build my reputation, to build my confidence, to show people that I wasn't any smarter than anybody, but I could outwork them. I could outwork them, and it got me respect a lot faster that I was willing to be lowered into the elevator shaft.
Some of the Black Sox stuff and things like that went to the hall, but what about all the rest of it? Was it kept? Was it thrown away? Was there ever any plan to have some kind of comprehensive White Sox archives or museums that fan could see?
No, we really didn't do that. We kept things that were kind of interest to us. Mm-hmm. One of the great things about operating a team is that you're not collectors. People, it's just not these ordinary. I mean, there's a picture right over there as we look of Bill Murray and Marv Goklang and me on the first day here. Or there's a picture when we put the 50,000 dots to play Twister on the field here. People save those kinds of things. Veeck's never did. So a lot of them were kept for years in just boxes and stored that they found when Don Unferth retired and people like that. We used stuff in the barge room, displays, and we did build that because we opened that occasionally to the public with the idea that you could bring good customers up and things like that. So we used all the stuff internally.
Mm-hmm. In 1978, your dad installed the shower and center field bleachers for the fans. I feel like the 1970s were a time when companies and teams and celebrities would have these really wild promotions. Evel Knievel attempted the Snake River Canyon jump on September 8th, 1974. Was that something that you were aware of and fascinated by? Was Evel Knievel somebody who resonated with you?
Yeah, the thing about Evel Knievel was that they called Dad, and whether he consulted or not, he explained to them, and I found this would be fascinating, that he explained that television was not going to dig a 14-second televised event. No matter, it could have been the second coming and you couldn't figure out how to get commercials in it. Mm-hmm. So he said, you have to build a thrill show all around this. So you had people riding motorcycles and the Wallendas walking across. That was the suggestion that he made. And that's ultimately what Knievel's people did. And of course, it was good that they did that because the Snake River jump kind of ended in less than spectacular fashion.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Tell me about Jeff Schwartz and how a dance contest at Comiskey Park in 1978 that was sponsored by Coke helped lead to the idea of Disco Demolition Night.
Jeff Schwartz was a record plugger. They called him back in those days, and he was at WLUP, but he'd been around Chicago forever, as far as I was concerned, and so we would tie the ball club together with whatever radio station and whatever artist that he was pushing. So disco comes on the scene. It's red hot. And we have that, and it was Toronto. Was it against Toronto? It doesn't matter, but it was a club that didn't have any drawing power. Mm-hmm. So we put up 20 platforms all around the ballpark and ran dance contests. So they ran dance contests at all of the disco joints in Chicago, and there were a lot of them. And then the semifinals they ran so that Coca-Cola got an ongoing promotion that could last theoretically over 4 weeks or 5 weeks, whatever they wanted, with the finals being on the field before a game at Comiskey Park. We draw 22,000 or something. I mean, it was astounding to me, and it was great theater. People love to look out at these kids dancing with such skill, we'll say. And so afterwards, we go to Miller's Pub, and we're laughing about drawing 22,000. Coca-Cola's thrilled. We're like marketing geniuses. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I said to Schwartz, it would be funny. It would be funny to have a night for people who don't like disco. I mean, and that was all. Everybody laughed and we all went home. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I mean, we were burning the candle back then at both ends. That was the birth of Disco Demolition.
Mm-hmm. July 12th, 1979 was scheduled to be a twilight doubleheader. You're a 28-year-old kid trying to draw people to the ballpark so your dad's business wouldn't go under. How did things get so out of hand on Disco Demolition Night?
First of all, it was a twilight doubleheader. Talk about obsolete, And it was not scheduled originally. It was a makeup game in there. And it was hard enough to draw on a Thursday night. Club wasn't going anywhere. And we'd been doing teen nights for years with some success, 3,000 or 4,000 people. So Schwartz calls me up one day and he goes, you're not going to believe this, but Steve Dahl just blew up a disco record on the air. And I said, who is Steve Dahl? And he said, he's on WLUP, and he does this really funny bit, and we should do it live. A couple days later, I'm knocking on the door of the studio, and I said to Steve, you want to do this? And he said, no, I don't want to do it. I opened a shopping center in Indiana last week, and it had 3,000 people, and it's just not. I said, it's not the same thing. We can draw a little. So we hammered it for 2 weeks on a 5,000-watt radio station that nobody had ever heard of. The mistake was mine. But the mistake that I made wasn't doing the promotion, and it wasn't this homophobic, as people have come to say now. It was simply, as you said, to draw people. But the mistake was I told the cops we were going to have 35,000 people. And they thought that was the funniest thing that they had heard all year. So we prepared for 25,000 people, and we got 100,000. And this thing about people telling you, oh, it was 50,000. There were 60,000 people in Comiskey on July 12th, 1979, Thursday night. It was rocking. And the mistake I made was I never convinced the cops. We just were understaffed. We didn't have enough security. Crowd control is a misnomer. I mean, if you go to a Rolling Stones concert and there's 25 or there's 50,000 people, if the crowd thinks of as one, you're never going to stop them.
Right.
Well, this was one of those times when they looked down, and the yellow jackets, as we call them, we put all our security so it was really visible. They were all off-duty Chicago cops. They were just outnumbered. And that was the mistake that I made. But the intentions and the racism involved and the book burning, as it's come to be referred to, I understand how people feel that way. But I can tell you, as the inventor of it, that wasn't anyone's intent, because that person was me, and I was raised in better fashion than that. So it's the best promotion in the history of sports. It's the worst promotion. I get used to getting pummeled every July 12th. I just kind of look forward to it, and the next day it dies down. But boy, it made some headlines. There were 7 pages in the Tribune, 6 pages in the Sun-Times. I mean, that's overkill. I never knew what a slow news day was. Well, I do now.
Well, it's funny because you and your family have a staunch reputation and track record for nearly 100 years of being inclusive, which we've extensively covered. Your grandfather invented Ladies' Day. Your father broke the color barrier in the American League. Even your mom was a strong proponent of civil rights, and your parents often welcomed civil rights leaders, including Dick Gregory and the Reverend Jesse Jackson, to their Maryland home. You hired the first woman to be an in-uniform coach in men's professional baseball history when you hired Justine Siegel, and you signed the first woman to play for a men's professional baseball team in history when you had Isla Borders pitch for you. So those comments in recent years, especially that Disco Demolition was racist, sexist, homophobic, is that revisionist history as we look back on things that were done years ago through the lens of what's acceptable today, or was there backlash at the time of people kind of saying those same things?
Never. I answered every complaint. We brought in one of those services, Girl Friday or Secretarial, because the letters were just nonstop. Not one time did anybody say, this is racist. I would have been horrified, and more importantly, I would have gone to their house to convince them that wasn't. So it is through the lens of today, and I understand that, and I'm fine with that because I would never do it today.
Right.
That's what it comes down to. But then to suddenly say that was my intent 45 years ago, that's unfair. And I don't accept that. I never wanted anybody to be hurt. I mean, my season ticket customers were mad at me for the rest of the season. I mean, do you think I really wanted to do that?
Yeah. In 1987 and 1991, the Minnesota Twins won the World Series. So in 1992, you decided you wanted to start an independent, unaffiliated minor league team and put them 7 miles from where the Minnesota Twins were drawing 3 million people in attendance at the Metrodome. What were you thinking?
Or not thinking. What I was thinking was that we were in a very difficult time in baseball, because in 1990, when I started what I laughingly refer to as my comeback after 10 years out, I had a promotion in Miami scheduled with the Miami Miracle. We were playing in Pompano Beach. And Orestes Minoso was going to get his at-bat in the 7th decade. And I had 3 busloads coming from Miami. And they called They, being the commissioner's office, called and canceled the day of and said, this is not in the best interest of baseball. And I was outraged. Plus, I needed those 3 busloads. That was a lot of people coming up.
Yeah.
So, we did the Orestes promotion because he's the kind of man that he was. I think is probably his spirit still knocking around somewhere. But he signed every autograph for every person. So the disaster was averted, but it left me with a really sour. Baseball had enough problems. We didn't need to create fake problems by saying Mignoso getting a at-bat at his age is not in the best interest of baseball. Fast forward, I didn't care that the Twins won 2 World Series. I didn't care that they played indoors because the one plan I had was to make it fun, to make fun of everything that we possibly could. Mm-hmm. And we did. And I happen to have a pretty good-sized chip on my shoulder, and so does St. Paul. Everybody said, you got to name it Minnesota. I said, no, we're going to call it what it is historically. We're going to call it the St. Paul Saints. We played outdoors. They had the Metrodome. We had blue sky. And we had Bill Murray, and we had Van Schley and Marv Goldklang, and we had absolutely no need to ask anybody's blessing. And that's what made independent baseball so rich and so wonderful. And, of course, everybody predicted we'd be out of business in 45 days. It's 30 years later, and we're still cooking.
I think almost every fan of any sport at some point in their life and fandom has thought to themselves, I could run a team. It couldn't be that hard. How wrong are they?
Wrong. It's hard.
What's the hardest part?
The hardest part is not falling in love with players at the independent level.
Yeah.
It's also, if you think that you can keep coming up and doing this, what running a team successfully means is you have to be able to delegate. My dad was a natural delegator. And you have to attract people who are of the same kind of thought process as you. And pretty soon you have a little engine and a little factory that pumps out ideas after ideas. It's very democratic. There's only one person who has to make a decision. And you have to make it work right away because we never had the luxury of being independently wealthy. So I put $150,000 down. That was my 25% stake in the Saints, $600,000, and we were off and running. But every game, there was anticipation of every day is opening day. Mm-hmm. What are they going to do? What's going to happen? And so we always had announced promotions, and we always had silly things that we did to get coverage. 13 clubs, 13 minor league teams opened and closed in the first 5 years of the Saints' history. Easy? No, I don't think so. Hire the best people you can and stay out of their way.
How do you strike a balance between making sure the ballpark experience is fun for the people who are going to come every game, but also fun and memorable for the people who only come to one game a year? Because the person who only comes to one game a year isn't going to know whether or not you do the same between inning routines or play the same videos on the Jumbotron every game. But the person who's there every game will know that, and eventually will get tired of that.
Right. So it has to change, and that's why this is the most wonderful job in the history of the world. Because your gags, Sister Roz or karaoke, Seigo Masabuchi has maybe the worst voice in the history of the world, and if we don't have him sing every night, I'd be lynched. It's just how it is. Mm-hmm. So you have to strike a balance between what's going to happen today. This is new. 35% of your tickets are sold to people who just love baseball. Mm-hmm. They don't care. Some of them wish I would set myself on fire, and self-immolate. Just go away. But that leaves 65% of the ballpark. And that's what you fill with ideas. And so, if you're a major league team, you have a beat writer. If you're a minor league team, and forget being an independent minor league team, you've got to attract attention mm-hmm. to get coverage. And that's the balance that you have to strike. You have to be all things to all people. You have to service people. For 25 years, I wrote 1,000 postcards to my season ticket holders to thank them personally. Mm-hmm. 25 years. I mean, that's a lot of writing. Yeah. I could write 23 an hour. I mean, but people, like they did with my dad, they felt an ownership in the Saints, in this mm-hmm. grand experiment. But it was fun, it was affordable, and it was family.
From their founding in 1993 through 2020, the Saints were an independent baseball team with no affiliation with Major League Baseball. They played in the Northern League from 93 to 2005 and the American Association of Independent Professional Baseball from 2006 to 2020. When you're an independent team, you can kind of do whatever you want. No gods, no masters. But you guys were more than just a team that had goofy promotions. You were good. You won the 2019 American Association Championship. And what does any major team do when they win a championship? They have a parade for their fans, which is exactly what the Saints did. Kind of. Tell me about the championship parade you guys had.
You know, one of the things that was so appealing about the Saints, and continues to this day to be so appealing about the Saints, we know our place in the food chain. I don't ever wake up and go, hey, I own the Saints. That's something. Mm-hmm. I may feel that way, but I never really think about it. You're in a major league market. This is the 13th largest metropolitan area in the country, right? So what do you have? You've got the Wild playing hockey. You've got the Gophers, which is a big college program. You've got the Timberwolves on occasion. You've got the Minnesota Twins. So you have every major sport. The Vikings, forget about it. I mean, this is football country more than anything. So you have all of this here. We announce we win the championship with a one-block parade. It's funny. People sit up and take notice. It gets a lot of coverage. But most importantly, it says to people they know their place. You know, if we had opened the Saints and said, come out and see unbelievably good baseball, we'd have been out of business. Mm-hmm. That wouldn't be true. If you want to see the best baseball in the world, you'd have to go to the Metrodome. If you want to see fun baseball designed for developmental, but mostly for people to have fun, then you come to the Saints.
The Saints became a major league affiliated team in conjunction with the reorganization of the minor leagues beginning with the 2021 season and are now the AAA affiliate of the Minnesota Twins. Since the Saints had no previous affiliation, how did that come about? Was it something that you applied for? Was it something where either Major League Baseball or the Twins directly approached you and asked if it's something you'd be interested in? How did that work?
People were interested in clubs being closer, and the Saints were the first really successful to play in the shadows of a major league team. And Dave St. Peter and the folks at the Twins are looking at just gargantuan costs in player development. And they have to fly players in and out. And the AAA club especially looks like a revolving door. We built a ballpark with the idea that somewhere down the road we'd attract some attention, but we didn't care whether we got a AA or a AAA club. But the more the Twins talked to us about it, I mean, you can get on the green line and ride from CHS Field to Target Field, which is very cool. And you can imagine what that does to the Twins' expense of having players back and forth and access to them. So now you find that when they reduce the number of clubs, which is all a control issue with MLB, they're also clustering them around their major league brethren. Well, they learned all that from the Saints. And what happened was Dave St. Peter called us one day, and, you know, this would never have happened under other people's watch. But the Polad family, they liked what the Saints did, and we worked with the Twins in joint promotions every year. So it was a natural step. And who said it? I'm sure they asked us. And my first question was, are you going to leave us alone? And they were unbelievably kind in their descriptions of what the Saints did. And they actually said, and I quote, we'd like a little of your marketing to rub off on us. So it was a marriage made in heaven. I don't feel that way about MLB. I think that there'll be restraints, but I won't have to deal with it.
All right, just a couple more and then we'll get you out of here. One of the reasons your dad came up with or allowed the Wild promotions that he did was to drive attendance because the team wasn't making enough money. But now with revenue sharing like he suggested, and TV deal money, both national and local, that's not a concern for any major league team. They're all making more money than they'll ever be able to spend regardless of attendance numbers. Every single team. If your dad owned a Major League Baseball team today, do you think he would do things that were even crazier because he just wanted to have fun? Or would he be forced to be more cautious and subdued because the other owners wouldn't want him to embarrass the brand?
He would never, ever be restrained by these artificial restraints. That's he was very much a man of his time. I mean, the exploding scoreboard wouldn't have worked in the 40s. It just wouldn't have worked. But as people became more and more interested, and, you think about popular mechanics and things like that. He once did a thing on the future of baseball. That Soxogram, right underneath that was the pitchometer, which has been in the rule book forever, 20-second clock. Now it's working. We pioneered that. We used it when we opened in 93. It failed after 2 at-bats. We tried it again going back a few years ago because attention spans are, and it's starting to work. So the fact that it's a new world, he would be all over the idea of mass marketing and electronic, digital. Those would be things that he would be using now. When he put Shea Torrent out in center field for the White Sox playing the organ, well, that was very timely for then. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you are. It's like the Savannah Bananas. He's a terrific operator, and he's using TikTok as a virtual billboard. And it's almost like there's nothing else happening in the world of sports on TikTok because Jesse Cole has tied it up. That's what my dad would be like.
Yeah. Your dad wasn't a super wealthy person, but back then he could still afford to own multiple professional sports teams. Somebody like him could never even dream of affording a team today. Has that shift in the economics now acting as a barrier to entry contributed to the lack of fun that we see in Major League Baseball today?
Yeah, I think so. There's also this political correctness that we're practicing so much of. He just said what he felt. And we're so careful what we say now. And people teach how to talk to the press. I'm not afraid of you. I think we can be friends. You can be critical of things I do. I cannot like what you write. Mm-hmm. I cannot like what you say on your podcast, but we can still get along. Yeah. And that's what people don't understand. Wayne Huizenga was a classic example. When you own Waste Management or Blockbuster, nobody interviews you except Forbes. And they expect the same boring. So when he was interviewed, when he's running the Marlins, he gives the same boring. And that's what, it limits characters. That Runyon-esque, if you will, or the Studs Terkels of the world. And that's unfortunate because when you're very wealthy, I assume, you look for people who do things the proper way. Mm-hmm. And that's death to a passionate pursuit of a sporting endeavor, in my opinion.
Has the way you view your relationship with your dad changed since his passing?
Yes. I used to say I would almost pontificate. I would say, hey, there was nothing left to say between these two men, father and son. We recently made a documentary. It took 3.5 years. And I have had to examine almost everything, as I think if you have half a brain, you do. And I realize by osmosis how much he taught me. Dealing with the death of my daughter. Everything I learned from my dad prepared me, even though there's no way you could be prepared for that. And the way you treat people, what Bill Veeck did, well, they weren't zany promotions and they weren't gimmicks, and he was a really good baseball guy. Satchel Paige, 6-1. Yes, the oldest guy and the rocking chair and all the thing, but underneath that,
it wasn't a gimmick.
It wasn't a gimmick.
Right.
And those are the very best ones.
Yes.
And so, I just think that as I look back and I realize all that I learned from him, he just made it so effortlessly. And now I'm attempting to make it effortlessly for my son.
How about your relationship with the Veeck name in general? Were you ever resentful of sharing that last name with two men who made such an impact on the sport? Was it important for you to carve out your own reputation and do things to create a name for yourself? Or did you enjoy the fact that you could carry on that name, that legacy?
Had no interest in it whatsoever. Got out of college on Tuesday, joined a rock and roll band. We were the house band a week later. I wanted no part. Who would want to be the son of a legend? It was a terrible, terrible thing. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't money involved. So I can't imagine how the Kennedys functioned, or when there's money and there's infamy or fame, call it whatever you will. I just wanted no part. I never believed that my dad was going to be elected to the Hall of Fame. We were raised to believe that just couldn't happen. And I think my mother deserves kudos for that, because when it did happen, we were all delightfully surprised.
Yeah.
But you do get to a certain point in your life where you think to yourself, what would he do? And my son Night Train convinced me that being fourth generation was something to be proud of. And I never really looked at it that way. And one day, I'm so stupid, I said to my father, I said, you don't know what it's like being your son. And he looked at me and he said, are you out of your mind? William Lewis Veeck Sr., the nicest man in baseball, you think I didn't have to figure out how to... And in my myopic vision, I hadn't thought of that. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty easy.
Yeah. Is there anything we didn't touch on or anything you'd like to speak about?
No, I think it was wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. How can people reach out to you and keep up with what you're doing these days?
They can go to mikeveeck.com or... Interestingly enough, Fun is Good. That's also a website because we do consulting work and hiring practices and retention programs that are based on all the things that I learned and I stole from my long line of, 110 years we've been doing this.
Yeah, pretty good run.
Yes, it was.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right.
I do yours.
Now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
When they tore down Comiskey Park many years ago, they memorialized the original site of home plate by a plaque that now is sitting in the parking lot of the current Sox Park. And you and I, being the historians that we are, of course, have stood over that plaque a time or two, being in Comiskey and remembering being there. To me, as a kid, I didn't go there very often, even though I'm born and raised in Chicago. But what I do remember about being in Sox Park is the aroma of Sox Park, which was, to me, cigars and pipes. And I loved that smell. And I still do to this day.
And beers and hot dogs, or was it just the smoke that you remember?
It wasn't just smoke. It wasn't cigarette smoke. It was specifically more like a pipe smoke or cigars.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was not food. It was that very distinctive aroma. I have been in many parks, have never experienced it, only there. And it was like the wooden seats had absorbed those odors and fragrances from decades of just having it seep in and the rain and the wetness and whatever. It just brought it out. You're right by the lake, and if you have a humid day in the summer, the humidity brings that out, and I loved it, and I still do to this day.
Yeah, it's a smell that elicits a feeling that you're like, this is familiar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It brings back fond memories because I would have been at those games with my dad and my grandfather, and so absolutely very fond memories.
All that being said, what did you think of the Mike Veeck interview?
What an outstanding heritage to have.
Yes. Like I said early in the interview, we could have done an episode just on his grandfather, we could have done an episode just on his father, and we could have done an episode just on him. So I know we packed a lot into this hour. Mike was gracious enough to give me an hour in St. Paul. We met at the Sabre Convention in Chicago, and he said, hey, if you want to come up to St. Paul during these dates, I'm going to be at the ballpark because they were retiring Darryl Strawberry's number and doing the movie premiere for the Netflix documentary, The Saint of Second Chances. So I'll be in St. Paul during these dates. If you want to come up, I'll sit down with you and do an interview then. So I drove all the way to St. Paul to sit and talk with Mike. And sure enough, he and Eddie Koblenz of the St. Paul Saints made it happen. So thank you to both of them. We did the interview at CHS Field where the St. Paul Saints play. We did it one afternoon before a game that night. So it was really cool. If you guys haven't had a chance to see The Saint of Second Chances, take that chance.
Yes.
It was really good. And that will fill you in on a lot of Mike's life story. I knew that that documentary was made and coming out, so I didn't feel the need to really go super in depth during this interview with Mike about his life.
Right.
The way I normally do with these types of interviews when we talk to people like this. So hopefully all the questions you have will be answered and filled in together.
When I went back and looked at my notes after listening to the interview, what jumps off the page to me is how courageous his grandfather and his father were It's one thing to just talk about these novel things that they came up with, the Ladies' Day and other things we'll talk about. But when you think of at the time that they were doing these things and what was going on in the United States, his grandfather was born in 1876. Baseball had just started out, not that many years before he's born, and it ends up that becomes his career, which is kind of interesting. But women didn't have the right to vote. Women weren't considered equal citizens within the United States until 1920. And so when his grandfather comes in, and just even listening to Mike talk about how did it come about that his grandfather became a vice president of the Chicago Cubs, and it was because he was a newspaper reporter and was writing honestly, fairly, whatever. And William Wrigley Jr. goes over and says, "You think you can do better?" His grandfather says, "Yeah." As a Chicagoan, listening to Mike Veeck tell that story, well, he's throwing around these names that are Chicago gold.
Yeah, the who's who of Chicago.
Right. You would talk to some young person in Chicago today, and they might know of the Veeck name. Gosh, I hope they know of the Wrigley Building, but it is Mr. Wrigley, and it is Mr. Veeck. And I'm listening to that thinking, okay, this is going on when these people are in their prime. And in 1919, when he started the Ladies' Day concept, to do something like that was very groundbreaking.
You know, originally Wrigley Field was built as Weigman Park in 1914 for the Federal League. The Cubs were not the original tenants of that building. The Federal League team only built the lower deck. There was no upper deck. So the Cubs start drawing all these fans because of William Veeck Sr. and his promotions and the way he was running the team. So they decided we need more seats. And that's when they built the second deck. It was under his leadership.
Wow.
He wasn't just a guy who filled the stands. He built a great team. And the Cubs franchise started going to World Series. They didn't win them because, you know, they're still the Cubs. But they were going to the World Series and became kind of a powerhouse.
Right. When he's involved and when he is brought up to the plate, so to speak, by Mr. Wrigley, what's going on in Chicago in 1917, the White Sox are in the World Series. And they do win that legitimately. But then 1918, the Cubs are in the World Series. They may not have won that one for whatever reason. But what a great time to be in Chicago, and what a high stakes point for Mr. Wrigley to say, you think you can do better, come on over, and follows through on that challenge. Just very cool. A very cool background of what's going on at an amazing time in the city. So his grandfather is challenging social mores, instituting Ladies' Day and saying it's like okay for women to come to sporting events and it's acceptable. But he also is bringing women into the workforce and in power positions. Right.
Not just as secretaries or waitresses or things like that. You know, this woman is the club secretary. And by the time her career is over, she's the vice president of the franchise.
Right. And even though she's vice president by 1958, 1958, it still was highly unusual for a woman to be on an executive board of any type of corporation.
Women couldn't have their own bank accounts or have a credit card or...
Okay, I was born in 1958. You still could not have your own credit card. So put this back how many years? When he's hiring her, putting her in that position as club secretary.
Yeah, 50 years before.
So again, put it in the context of the time in which they were living. And the admiration can only go up from there.
Absolutely.
Then you look at his son, Junior, Bill Veeck, when he is suggesting that he wants to buy the 1942 Phillies. Frick and Landis are afraid he's going to field a whole team of Negro players. Talk about taking on a big challenge, no small moves. That's kind of a Chicago thing. You know, Daniel Burnham, no small plans. That was Bill Veeck on the social side of things.
And there's speculation of whether those actually were his intentions or not. But that seems consistent with the Veeck line of thinking. He then does become the person to integrate the American League.
Which is phenomenal. But what he's doing in his private life, he is friends with Larry Doby. They go to jazz clubs or juke joints, as Mike said. Growing up in Chicago, I never thought of Chicago as a segregated city the way the South was segregated at that time. But Chicago still was a very divided city. It's a segregated time. There were neighborhoods, and there definitely was a division, and that was it. Well, now, these are the times we're talking about. You know, this is 1947, when Larry Doby comes on and that friendship starts or whatever. But even Bill Veeck in 1947 paying the black female owner for Larry Doby's contract.
Effa Manley of the Newark Eagles.
And did he have to do that? Apparently not, because you look to the other white owners of what they were doing, and even Branch Rickey wasn't doing that.
And he was actively not paying them. It's not like he just forgot.
Right. Oh, yeah.
He knew he could get away with doing it because what were they going to do?
Right.
Yeah. But then you also look at people like Joe Gordon, who Mike brought up as being the guy who played catch with Larry Doby on the Cleveland Indians. Joe Gordon is a Hall of Famer. He was a 9-time All-Star and finished in the top 5 in MVP voting 5 times in his career, winning the award in 1942. He missed the 1944 and 45 seasons while he was serving in the military, then came back and was selected to 4 straight All-Star games from 46 through 49. So he is one of the most highly regarded players of that time and a white guy. And here he is going out and playing catch with Larry Doby. And whether it's explicitly stated or not, being able to see that happen sends a message. This is acceptable. I don't care what color his skin is. He's going to help us win. If that's the type of player that Bill Veeck has on his team, there's no wonder why they were starting to win games. You know, they win the World Series in 48. They go back in 54. They're a good team.
That message is coming down from the top.
Right.
And it's not just words. So thinking of the movie 42 and just the Jackie Robinson story, yes, Branch Rickey is an advocate for Jackie and mental support and all that. You don't see them necessarily socializing. And Branch Rickey may have given directives to the team or to the manager to pass on to the team, but Bill Veeck is walking the walk. He is showing by example the way he's living his life. This is the right thing to do.
Well, going back to the story that Mike told about when his father was a little kid and counting the money on the table with his grandfather, what color is the money? It's green. What color is the person who put it in there? I don't know. Same thing with your players. What color is he? It doesn't matter. Is he going to help us win?
Right.
All money counts the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what color you are.
Right.
Can you make this team better? If the answer is yes, then let's play.
Right. When Mike was talking about his dad taking advantage of some discord within the Comiskey family in 1959, and that's how Bill Veeck then becomes an owner the first time with the White Sox, it just made me think for a second, how much history do I really know about who the owners of the White Sox were? Because obviously I know a thing or two about Charles Comiskey owning, but then I didn't really know exactly how long the Comiskey family was involved in the ownership of the team. And even in 1959, Bill Veeck became the majority owner, but did that mean he brought in a cartel of other partners, or were Comiskey still involved? So we did look at that. We shared the history of who the owners were from the time Charles Comiskey was the initial owner through the Reinsdorf era, which we're still in.
But let's talk about the fact that the Chicago White Sox organization started in 1895 as the St. Paul Saints.
How about that?
We'll have another episode later on that is with a historian of the St. Paul Saints, where we talk about the history of the franchise and all of the great players that have come through there. But if you go to CHS Field in St. Paul, they have what's called the City of Baseball Museum, which is a really worthwhile stop. It's free if you are at the game. It talks about the history of baseball in St. Paul and all of the black neighborhoods that are around and all of the people like Tony Stone, who grew up in the area, and people like George Halas, who played for the St. Paul Saints.
Oh.
And all sorts of people throughout the rich history of that franchise. So Comiskey bought the team and was friends with Ban Johnson. It was a part of the Western League. Ban Johnson's going to create the American League and basically tells Comiskey, if you bring your team to a better market, we can put you into this American League that we're going to try and make a second major league and challenge the National League. And so that's what he does. He brings the team to Chicago, calls them the White Sox, and starting in 1901, they've been an American League major league team. So everything being tied together, from the St. Paul Saints early history, the original version of the St. Paul Saints, to talking about Comiskey as the owner. And he was owner, so technically from 1895 of the White Sox, even though the Chicago White Sox didn't exist until 1901, he owned the franchise that it was before that until 1930.
So then I'm assuming his children and then grandchildren, because through the 30s, J. Lewis Comiskey, for about 15 years, Grace Comiskey, a female owner. And then 56 and 57, Chuck Comiskey and Dorothy Comiskey Rigney. And perhaps this is what is the discord in the Comiskey family that Mike referred to, because in 1958, Chuck Comiskey, and now it's Bill Veeck, not Dorothy. So obviously, Dorothy and Chuck have the parting of ways, and Bill Veeck comes in. And what a trio of years for Bill Veeck to be there, because obviously 1959 is a key year for any Chicago White Sox fan. I have a very good friend, John, who was a kid back then, and that is like the best summer of his life. And he still holds it that way because of the Chicago White Sox, the Go-Go Sox. But then they sell to the Allen brothers, which you referred to in the interview. That name does not ring a bell with me whatsoever. So at first it was both brothers in 61, and then at the end of the 60s, it's just the one brother into the 70s. And I was aware of my surroundings at that point and still just do not remember that name. And then Bill Veeck comes back. And I have to say, again, the name of Bill Veeck is always a positive connotation. Always. A guy who was just there and saved the team and brought happiness to the city. And then from that last time he owns it, then we go to Jerry Reinsdorf.
Bill Veeck has some pretty fun quotes. One, this world would be better if more people didn't take it too seriously. And I think that is kind of the through line from Bill and Mike together. You know, the baseball is fun, fun is good. Just the whole concept, the whole mentality of the product on the field is important. And if the team is winning, yeah, people are going to want to support it. But there are going to be years where the team isn't winning. And it still needs to be fun for people to come out to the ballpark in those years, too. Another good quote from Bill Veeck is, there are only two seasons, winter and baseball. Kind of like the old Chicago quote, there's only two seasons in Chicago, winter and construction season.
That's exactly what I thought when you said that.
Yeah. But, you know, the idea of the ballpark should be fun, and Bill Veeck builds the exploding scoreboard based on him seeing the pinball machines in The Time of Your Life with James Cagney.
Right.
Pulling inspiration from anywhere. Who would have thought you're going to watch a movie and figure out like, oh, I can use this on the baseball field.
Right.
I can build something with the team that I own, in the stadium that I own, and it's going to be something that lasts for 60 years.
It becomes another man on the field when you're in that stadium, whether it is another home run just adding on, or if it's a home run that all of a sudden takes the lead in the game, forget about it. You know, the stadium's going wild, and you immediately look to that scoreboard, and you're watching it start to build up until it explodes, and it just encapsulates everything that is going on in the excitement of the fans, and then boom.
Think about how, as the pitcher who gave up the home run, how demoralizing it is to just give up a home run, and then the scoreboard explodes, and then the whole crowd gets in. Like, it's, the momentum changes.
Exactly right. And that's what I mean. It is another man on the field. It's like another asset.
Mike talked about how some of the opposing players and managers would make fun of the scoreboard because they didn't like the effect that it had. It's not because they thought it was stupid. It's because it was ruining their morale.
Right. Yeah. And when you go to a field that doesn't have that, it's kind of disappointing because you're looking for something. You know, it's like your expectation is there. And to think that he tapped into how exciting that would be, I love it. It is something I enjoy whenever I'm in Sox Park and see it go off.
I thought it was interesting talking about how the 70s were kind of this wild time in American history with just weird promotions and weird celebrities who were famous for doing goofy things. And I just took a shot in the dark by asking Mike about Evel Knievel. I just figured, like, that's who Mike seems to be. Not that he's doing stunts or putting his life in danger, but he's a showman. He wants to do things that are exciting and get people's attention. And I just brought up the Snake River Canyon jump, and come to find out, Evel Knievel's people reached out to Bill Veeck to be like, what's the best way to promote this?
How about that?
What a discovery. Just stumbled upon that. So that was cool to learn.
When Mike was talking about being the owner's kid, and he has the shirt to prove it, and he goes down the elevator shaft, and holy cow, he goes down there and he finds signed contracts from the Black Sox. Doing the math, he goes down in 1976-ish, January, I think he said January 76 is when he started working. So it's 60 years later, roughly. And they're still there and not messed up from the mechanics or the oil or the whatever. Seriously, can you imagine?
Well, I asked after that, did the White Sox have any plans to create some sort of archive that was open to the public or some sort of museum? Because the Cleveland Indians set up their Team Hall of Fame in 1951 and had a museum in the stadium. And they were the first team to do that, really.
Cool.
And so that was just a couple years after Bill sold the team. I don't know if that's an idea that they had in the idea box,
Right.
that Mike was responsible for. The Veecks only own the Indians from 46 to 49, so that's not a ton of time to implement every idea that you've got, but maybe it's something that they come up with or talk about, and then it finally happens a couple years later. But they clearly still had some sort of reverence for Cleveland. They kept their finger on the pulse. There were only 8 teams in the American League back then, so it was easy to know what was going on with the other teams. So it wouldn't have surprised me to think that's something that the White Sox could think about doing, especially under Bill Veeck's ownership the second time around. But I guess not.
I wonder what the temperature was about the Black Sox at that point, because when I was going to games at Comiskey, just as a fan that, you didn't necessarily have access to some of the secret places within the stadium or whatever, but when we would start going to New Comiskey, we did have access sometimes, and it took a long time before you saw like a 1917 World Series jersey.
Absolutely. It's been in the past decade.
Yeah, it was like hidden knowledge.
I think at that point, December 16th, 1951, Joe Jackson was supposed to be on Toast of the Town, which turned into the Ed Sullivan Show. So this was late in 1951. Earlier in that summer, the Cleveland Indians create their team Hall of Fame. They put it up to a fan vote. Who are the 10 Cleveland Indians from throughout history that deserve to be in the inaugural class? And the fans decide Joe should be one of those 10.
Yeah.
Granted, that was a different franchise, but that fan base was like, it's been 30 years. He deserves to, as we say now, receive his flowers. And I think that is kind of the prevailing thought from the White Sox at the time, too. It had been long enough. The guys paid their price. Their careers were clearly over. Maybe up and through the 20s and into the 30s, there was still some sort of resentment, and the team or the league felt like we have to keep these guys out because they are technically still young enough that they could come back and play.
Yeah.
But by the 40s, 50s, 60s, it's over.
Right.
And most of them had passed away anyways. So I don't think that story had really become the famous, the average person didn't know about the Black Sox scandal at that time. It wasn't until 8 Men Out, the book was written in 1963. So that was the first time it was really like brought back into the mainstream. But even that, it wasn't like a New York Times bestseller. Like it's not like every person read that book. And then 25 years go by, and that's when they make 8 Men Out in 1988, and then Field of Dreams in 1989. That is when the Black Sox scandal story became part of the public consciousness for the people who didn't experience it the first time around in real time.
Right.
So I think, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I don't think people had this chip on their shoulder.
Maybe not the fan base, but who is finding this, and who, it's the management of the team and the owners of the team. And I don't know, maybe they had a different feel of, you don't have the Field of Dreams to give a different side of it yet.
Yeah, but just think about when you're talking to your father or your grandfather and they're reliving their childhood, they're recalling, memories that they had as a kid and who was their favorite player. That generation now is getting, at any point in time, as they're older, they want to honor the players from their youth.
Right.
And so in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when those people in their 60s and 70s at that point, their childhood heroes were the Black Sox. So maybe they lost the 1919 World Series, but they won the 1917 World Series. It was still a great team.
Right.
They're on their way in 1920 again. And as an older adult, especially if you see other teams starting halls of fame and rings of honor and things like that, and museums, the Baseball Hall of Fame starts in 36, people are starting to be honored.
Yeah.
So you've got to think like, okay, well, who from my childhood do I want honored? And of course it's going to be Shoeless Joe Jackson and Happy Felsch and Ray Schalk and the guys who were the best players on the best team in the history of the franchise. You'd think the fans want to have those guys remembered. Maybe the team didn't want to. But again, I don't think that there was this kind of animosity against that team in those years that there was later on.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But speaking of people having animosity, let's talk about Disco Demolition a little bit.
Let's talk about Disco Demolition. I have to say something. It's always Steve Dahl and Disco Demolition. And it was Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer, who was Steve Dahl's partner. And so I did a little research after we were talking about it and went in to look up sources on when it was happening. And there was Gary Meyer. So they were partners at that point, and it was definitely, and they went on from that point from WLUP. they became a very prominent team on WLS, which was,
The 50,000 watt.
Right.
Not the 5,000 watt. Yeah.
So kudos to Gary Meyer for being there too and surviving, and somehow his name got under the radar, so Steve has taken all the brush back. But here in Chicago, it's been in the news about disco demolition and how it was a way to trash black music and all these things that are negative. And, I was an aware adult in 1979. I was, already married at that point. I don't remember that at all. Not at all, any of those things. Not being homophobic, not being sexist, not being racist. And then I'm second guessing myself because, again, you do kind of forget. And so it was validating to hear Mike say that wasn't his intent, and all the response he got in current
real time, yeah.
Then, that wasn't it at all. If you understood what disco was, it was very polarizing because it was just a whole different thing. But when you think of how it became a thing across the whole strata of culture here, it was Saturday Night Fever and the Bee Gees and John Travolta. And so there were people who either loved it or hated it. And
I think there were probably people who didn't really care one way or the other about how the music sounded or the look of the fashion or things like that, but they were just sick of being inundated with it because it was everywhere.
Right.
And they're just like, listen, I don't care if it's good or not. I'm just sick of hearing this. Like when you have a commercial that plays every commercial break over, and you're just like, I'm never going to buy that company's product because I just hate the commercial.
Right.
That's how people will feel about disco at that time. Some certain people.
Yeah. They just wanted to wear normal heeled shoes again and just go back to normal life. So there was that.
Yeah, but to hear that, a team that wasn't good that year tell the police we're expecting 35,000, they laugh at them, and then 100,000 people show up. You got 60 in the stadium and 40 outside.
Right.
Mike says the mistake was just not having enough security. Like he said, at a certain point, it doesn't matter how many security you have because you're not going to have a 1-to-1 ratio between security and the fans.
Right.
So if they start deciding we can overpower the Yellow Jackets, it doesn't matter how many people he had. So it seems like over the years he has come to terms with the fact that like it is what it is. Like he said, it was the best sports promotion ever. It was also the worst.
Right.
Nothing he can do to change it at this point.
And when you talk about what the demographic of WLUP was at that point and the target group and the people who showed up, and then you throw in pyrotechnics, recipe for disaster.
It was interesting, though, watching the Saint of Second Chances because disco demolition happened in 79. I was born in 86, so I wasn't around for it. I've seen pictures of it. It's covered in the newspapers, and I can go back and read articles, but I had never seen real good video footage. You'll get a 2 or 3 second clip here, and it's black and white or whatever. It's grainy. The Saint of Second Chances had minutes of footage and like all sorts of different angles and showing Bill Veeck coming on the loudspeaker, trying to calm the crowd down and singing Take Me Out to the Ballgame to like, all right, guys, let's all get on the same page here. Let's all get back to our seats. I didn't know any of that happened.
Right.
And to see high definition footage, I don't know if they shot it on 8mm or 35 or whatever. Like it had been digitized and modernized in a way that it was clear footage that I had never seen before. That was really cool to me. And
it showed the evolution of how it started out as a normal event and then things go sideways.
Yeah. Yeah, that was cool. Also in Saint of Second Chances, Charlie Day from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia plays a young Mike Veeck.
Right.
It's a documentary, but it's also a biopic kind of. And so that was cool. And then Jeff Daniels was the narrator.
Yeah.
I was very surprised to see like the cast of this documentary. It was cool. And tons of great archival footage, lots of really cool footage of Bill Veeck speaking and just like in his life throughout the years on and off the field.
Right.
So it was something worth watching if you have a chance to do it.
It's great because if you're like me, I'm someone who was alive when Bill Veeck was an owner. It was great to see footage of him in his prime. And I never knew what his prime was. I didn't know. Think about it. He had 3 teams over the course. That's something.
Yeah.
And all the things he was doing, like going back to who he was as a guy and the comment about having Dick Gregory and Jesse Jackson to his home. Think of what Chicago was. Martin Luther King marched through Chicago, came and lived in the projects on the South Side to shed light on the housing situation in urban cities when they built the projects. And that's what was going on in the city. It was like sitting on a keg of dynamite just waiting for things to explode. And that's who he was. So again, just I have a lot of admiration for all that's going on. And when Mike was talking about his mom being the first public relations person for the Ice Capades, that's a woman working in a skilled level of management, not just being a secretary or an operator or,
Yeah, she was a decision maker,
Right.
not an errand runner.
a very polished woman. And I don't know how long she worked, but obviously just a match made in heaven, two people of the same mind. You have 6 kids. I like that every child's born in a different city. I don't know if that was a goal or it just worked out that way. She sounded like an amazing woman with the words of advice that she was giving him and his siblings about how to stay humble and how to be a person. Well done, Mom.
Yeah. We didn't really talk too much with Mike about his ownership of the St. Paul Saints or other minor league teams, but let's talk real quick about the fact that Mike Veeck continued the tradition of hiring women and signing women. Justine Siegel becoming the first uniformed coach in professional baseball, and Isla Borders becoming the first player.
Right.
Those are 2 big stories. To me, the through line of this interview is all 3 generations did whatever they could to draw fans, make people feel included, and
Blow through barriers that were set to advance all people.
yes, whether that be because of race or gender or anything else.
That's right.
Like the story he told, what color is the money? Green. What color is the person? It doesn't matter. Same concept. If I can bring somebody in who can make this more fun, who can make us win, who can make us draw bigger crowds, I don't care anything else about them. Let's just do it. Let's have fun.
Right. And after they are the groundbreakers with that, you just take it for granted. But somebody had to be the first. And all the guys before them didn't have the courage to be the first. And they do. And that is a very admirable trait because they're lifting up other people.
Yeah. He's carried on the tradition, the Veeck
Yeah.
way, doing all these crazy promotions and doing whatever he can to get publicity for his teams. And watching Saint of Second Chances, they talk a lot about Darryl Strawberry's tenure with the team and how they brought him back and gave him his second chance.
That was amazing.
And in our interview, Mike talked about kind of the comparisons between Eddie Goodell, who was a little person that his father had hired, and Dave Stevens, who was a man with no legs, who Mike hired. And in the documentary, Dave Stevens and Darryl Strawberry have this relationship that they're on the team together, they're playing catch together, and Darryl Strawberry told Mike, "You taught me to love the game again." That was a quote that stuck out to me, that is who Mike Veeck is. That is who his father was. I'm sure that's who his grandfather was. They were just people who loved the game and did whatever they could to make the people around them love the game too.
Right.
Okay. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, and you'll be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. You can also sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I'll use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I'll also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. Look for a new issue to be published on the 2nd Friday and the 4th Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. If you know current or former ball players, managers, broadcasters, or journalists who you can help us get in touch with, or if you are one, let's talk. During our interview, Mike and I talked a little bit about the most famous ballpark promotion in his career, Disco Demolition Night. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I wanted to go over some other wild promotions that Mike has been behind in his career. As you know, Mike owned the St. Paul Saints for 30 years, starting in 1993. Prior to the 2021 season, the Saints were an independent team with no major league affiliation. This allowed Mike and the Saints to As Mike would say, have fun. Consider the following promotions, which had all been held by the Saints before they became affiliated. During the 2002 Major League Baseball labor negotiations, the Saints gave away seat cushions with pictures of Commissioner Bud Selig on one side and Players Association Executive Director Donald Fair on the other. In April of 2006, the Saints announced that rubber boats would be given out during a May 27, 2006 game to honor the 30th anniversary of the television show The Love Boat. Details of the promotion indicate that it was intended as a jab at the 2005 boat scandal involving the Minnesota Vikings, where several members of the team were allegedly involved in illicit behavior on a private cruise. The promotional rubber boats were purple and yellow, the same color as the Vikings' uniforms, and the boat was named Minnetonka Queen, a reference to Lake Minnetonka where the cruise took place. Both coincidences, I'm sure. On July 23, 2011, the Saints celebrated National Hot Dog Day and parodied Anthony Weiner and his first sexting scandal. The first 1,501 fans aged 18 or older received Tweeting Weiner boxer shorts depicting a blue bird taking a picture of a hot dog. The bird was deliberately drawn to resemble the logo of Twitter, which was the social media site that Weiner used to send links to indecent photos. As wild as those promotions were, there have been a handful of promotions which were canceled because they were just too out there, even for a Veeck. The Charleston River Dogs were scheduled to hold a vasectomy night. It was supposed to be a Father's Day promotion, in which at least one lucky fan was to have won the operation, but it was canceled after a local Catholic diocese complained. The River Dogs had previously canceled a Voodoo Night promotion, which was set for Friday the 13th of April in 2001. The idea was to give out voodoo dolls and hold chants, but it turned out that April 13th that year was also Good Friday, so the team decided against following through with that one. Disco Demolition Night is obviously the most infamous promotion of Mike's career that actually took place. The event was held after Game 1 of a scheduled twilight doubleheader at Comiskey Park, but due to safety concerns and the condition of the playing field after the demolition of Disco, Game 2 was canceled and the White Sox officially forfeited that game to the Detroit Tigers. In the early days of the major leagues, forfeits were not rare. In 1871, 6 games were forfeited in 2 months. There was at least one forfeit almost every year from 1882 until 1909. 1884, for example, saw forfeits in the double digits, many because one team failed to appear for a game or refused to continue playing after a game got out of hand. Sometimes teams would forfeit games if they lacked enough players to even take the field. In games that were played before the advent of stadium lighting, or games which were subject to a relatively early curfew, forfeits were also sometimes declared as a result of a team's stalling tactics. A baseball game scheduled for 9 innings is not official until 5 innings have been completed, or 4.5 innings if the home team is winning. Consequently, a team that was behind by a considerable number of runs before the end of the 5th inning might deliberately slow down the game, in the hopes that darkness or the curfew would come before the game was declared official. This was because, for most of baseball history, games ended before becoming official were replayed from the beginning at a later date. There are also a handful of incidents throughout history where a game was technically forfeited because fans rushed onto the field with 2 outs in the 9th inning, thinking a play that had just happened resulted in the final out of the game. An out hadn't been recorded, and the umpires decided to call the game instead of clearing the fans off the field for one more out. Disco Demolition took place on July 12, 1979, and was only the 4th forfeit in Major League Baseball since 1954. There has only been one forfeit since. 3 of the last 4 Major League forfeits resulted from promotions that backfired, with the most recent forfeit happening on August 10, 1995. The Cardinals were in Los Angeles to play the Dodgers, and it happened to be baseball giveaway day at Dodger Stadium. The game was delayed in the 7th inning when some fans started throwing their souvenir baseballs onto the field. In the bottom of the 9th, with St. Louis leading 2-1, the first batter, Raul Mondesi, was called out on strikes. He started to complain to umpire Jim Quick and was ejected. Dodger manager Tommy Lasorda was ejected as well. The fans became upset and started throwing their souvenir baseballs onto the field again. The umpires brought the Cardinals in from the field while the grounds crew cleared away all the baseballs launched from the stands. When play resumed, the fans again bombarded the field and the umpires forfeited the game in favor of St. Louis. In the liner notes, I'll link to the retro sheet page with the full list of forfeits in Major League Baseball's history. Each entry has a description of the forfeited game along with their newspaper reference. Gary Fraunfelter compiled the information to create the list, which is a really fun read. One of my favorite entries is the forfeit which happened on June 13, 1924, between the Yankees and the Tigers. Babe Ruth led off the 9th inning of a game at Navin Field in Detroit, with the Yankees leading 10-6. A young left-handed Tiger pitcher, Bert Cole, was on the mound. Ruth had to duck out of the way twice from pitches near his head before fouling out to first baseman Lou Blue. The next batter, Bob Musial, was plunked in the ribs with the first pitch. He dropped his bat, walked to the mound, and took a swing at the pitcher, but missed. Umpires Billy Evans and Red Ormsby grabbed Musial and pulled him away. About that time, Ruth charged from the dugout, swinging his fist and claiming that the pitcher was throwing at the Yankees. Players poured onto the field, and pushing and shoving ensued. After a few minutes, peace seemed to be restored and players started to return to their positions. However, Musial and Ruth took a detour on the way back to their dugout and headed to the Tigers' bench to start fighting again. The fans could no longer control themselves and streamed onto the field. Police quickly surrounded the dugout and escorted the players to safety. Fistfights between fans and policemen, and between fans and other fans, broke out all over the field. It took over half an hour to clear the field, but by that time the umpires had already called the game for New York. And don't forget, it's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means that more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.